Contraction of skeletal muscles is the topic of the screencast, which may be found in Chapter 6 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to help you achieve the following objectives: explain the effects of muscle fiber length on the amount of tension produced by the muscle fiber, describe a twitch, unfused tetany, and fused tetany, and describe their effects on the tension produced by a skeletal muscle fiber. Define isometric and isotonic contractions. Contrast concentric and eccentric isotonic contractions. And lastly, explain how motor units produce smooth, sustained contractions of skeletal muscles. Up to this point, we have focused on contraction at the cellular level, at the level of skeletal muscle fibers. Now we're going to begin to look at contraction of skeletal muscles at the organ level. Contraction of our skeletal muscles is graded. And what do I mean by graded? Well, skeletal muscles can generate a small amount of tension or force, such as what's needed to hold up a couple of very light flowers, or skeletal muscle contraction can generate a lot of force, such as what is needed to carry a heavy object. So now we want to talk about how skeletal muscles can vary how much force they generate. The force an individual skeletal muscle exerts depends on two things. First, the force that's produced by each contracting fiber, and two, the number of active motor units. First, let's look at what determines the force produced by an individual contracting skeletal muscle fiber. So, at the fiber level, at the skeletal muscle fiber level, the amount of force that a skeletal muscle fiber produces is dependent upon the amount of cross bridges that are formed between myosin heads and thin filaments. The greater the cross bridge formation, the greater the force that is generated. Skeletal muscle fiber length can change the amount of cross bridges formed and therefore affect the amount of tension produced. This is referred to as the length-tension relationship. This length-tension relationship is illustrated by this figure from your book. We have on the y-axis contraction strength, and we have on the x-axis sarcomere length. There is a sarcomere length where cross-bridge formation is maximal, and therefore there is a maximum amount of force generated by a skeletal muscle fiber. This is considered the optimal sarcomere length because we get the maximum amount of strength or tension produced. As the sarcomere shortens from this optimal length, there is greater overlap between the thin filaments, making fewer myosin binding sites available. And therefore there is less cross-bridge formation, and therefore there is a reduction in contraction strength or tension. On the flip side, as sarcomere length increases above optimum, there is less and less overlap between the thin and thick filaments, and therefore there is also a drop in contraction strength. You can demonstrate this length-tension relationship by performing a biceps curl. Holding a weight in your hand, start with an arm straight and elbow extended. In this position, the biceps muscle is relaxed and lengthened. Lift the weight palm up by flexing your elbow. As you do, the muscle shortens. When you perform this action, you'll notice that it is most difficult at the very beginning and at the very end of the curl. And this is because the sarcomeres are too long at the outset and too short at the end. The middle portion of the curl is relatively easy, because the sarcomeres are at their optimal length and can therefore generate the most force. Frequency of stimulation of a skeletal muscle fiber can also determine how much tension it produces. This has been studied in the lab using a frog gastrocnemius muscle. A preparation including a live gastrocnemius muscle, that's the calf muscle of a frog, with the nerves intact, are attached to an electrode. The electrode can deliver an electrical stimulus, causing the muscle to contract, and then a recording device produces a myograph, or a graph that illustrates the amount of tension produced over time. This slide illustrates a myogram. Tension is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. The small red, or somewhat red, arrow there will indicate when an electrical stimulus is being delivered to a muscle. A twitch is the muscle's response to a single brief electrical stimulus. As shown by the myogram, there's an increase in tension after the electrical stimulus is delivered, and then there is a drop in tension back to zero. What's happening when a twitch is occurring? Well, that single brief electrical stimulus causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. As calcium is released, it binds the proteins on the thin filaments, opening up the myosin binding sites. Myosin then binds to the thin filaments, forming cross bridges. This generates tension. However, recall that calcium does not remain in the cytoplasm very long. It's immediately taken back up by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When that occurs, the tension begins to drop, eventually back down to zero. So that is what occurs during a twitch. You have this very fast increase in tension and then drop in tension in response to a single brief electrical stimulation. I want to be clear that twitches do not occur normally. This is something that's being produced in a lab. So we observed that a brief single electrical stimulation causes a rise in tension and then a drop in tension, and that's called a twitch. And we saw this rise in tension and this drop in tension due to the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and then the reuptake of that calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, let's observe what occurs if we deliver several electrical stimulations in succession. So here we have 3 electrical stimulations being delivered to that frog gastrocnemius muscle. After the first stimulation, we see a rise in tension, and it begins to decline as the calcium moves back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Then another electrical stimulation is delivered. Calcium moves back out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and there is a rise in tension. And this rise in tension is even greater than the tension produced from the previous stimulus. Then we see tension beginning to fall again as that calcium moves back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Then a third electrical stimulation is delivered to the gastrocnemius muscle, and again we see a rise in tension, this time to a level greater than the tension produced by the 2 previous electrical stimulations. And then in the absence of additional stimulations, there is a fall in tension back to zero. With each subsequent stimulation, there is an increase in tension. This is referred to as the summing of contractions, or tetanus. So what's going on? Well, with each subsequent stimulation, there is a greater and greater amount of calcium in the cytoplasm. So when the original or the initial stimulus is delivered, calcium moves out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. However, that one stimulation is not enough to provide enough calcium to open up all the binding sites. As the calcium begins to move back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and another stimulation is delivered, more calcium moves from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm such that the concentration is greater than it was after the first stimulation. So we have more calcium, more myosin binding sites available, more cross bridges formed. Then some of the calcium moves back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and a third stimulus, electrical stimulation, is delivered. More calcium leaves the sarcoplasmic reticulum such that now the concentration of calcium in the cytoplasm is greater than it was after the first or second electrical stimulations were delivered. With a greater amount of calcium in the cytoplasm, we have a greater number of myosin binding sites available, a greater number of cross bridges being formed, and therefore a greater amount of tension being produced after the third stimulation than was produced by the first or second stimulations. This summing of contractions, this stepwise increase in tension, is called tetanus. It's specifically in this case called incomplete tetanus because you do have some resting occurring between subsequent stimulations. Again, this stepwise rise in tension results from a greater and greater amount of calcium ions in the cytoplasm, opening up a greater and greater number of myosin binding sites, resulting in a greater and greater number of cross bridges being formed. And that's why you see this increase in tension with each subsequent electrical stimulation. So again, we observed that there is a stepwise increase in tension produced by a skeletal muscle with each subsequent electrical stimulation. And this is unfused or complete tetanus because there is a small amount of resting of the muscle between subsequent stimulations as calcium moves back, or a small amount of calcium moves back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum between stimulations. Electrical stimulations can be delivered at a high enough frequency, however, that no calcium moves back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum between stimulations. And this results in a maximum sustained production of tension, and this is called fused or complete tetanus. In the human body, motor neurons do not generate action potentials at a high enough frequency to produce complete tetanus, at least not normally. Unfused or incomplete tetanus would be considered the normal physiological condition. So if incomplete tetanus is the norm, right, the normal physiological condition, why don't you perceive these small, brief relaxations when you contract the muscle? Because of course you know your skeletal muscle contraction is nice, smooth, and sustained. Well, this reflects the fact that skeletal muscle, the organ, is composed of many skeletal muscle fibers, and those skeletal muscle fibers are organized into motor units. Going back to this figure, we have a skeletal muscle with 3 different motor units, and the skeletal muscle fibers of each motor unit are color-coded magenta, blue, and green. So as the skeletal muscles of motor unit A are contracting, perhaps the skeletal muscles of motor unit B are relaxing. And as the skeletal muscles of motor unit A began to relax, those of motor unit B began to contract. And as as the skeletal muscle fibers of motor unit B began to relax, the skeletal muscle fibers of motor unit C contract. And so that alternating activity between the skeletal muscles of the various motor units produce a smooth, sustained contraction. Alternating activity between motor units also allow muscles to contract continuously without fatiguing. All of the skeletal muscles of your body are partially contracted all day long. You don't necessarily feel this because it is the norm, but as long as you are alive, all of your skeletal, and there is a connection between the nervous system and your skeletal muscles, you exhibit a certain amount of what is called muscle tone. So all of your skeletal muscles are at least partially contracted throughout the day, yet they don't become fatigued. Let's specifically talk about some of your postural muscles. These are the muscles that are responsible for you maintaining your posture. Think about the muscles on the posterior side of your neck. All day long, they must contract and produce enough force to hold your head up. Yet, normally, by the end of the day, those muscles are not fatigued. Well, if they've been contracting all day, holding your head up all day, why are they not fatigued? Well, this is because throughout the day, different motor units in those skeletal muscles are active while others are at rest. So they alternate between resting and producing tension, and therefore they never become fatigued. So not only does alternating activity of motor units produce smooth, sustained contractions, they also allow constant muscle tone, and for certain postural muscles responsible for maintaining posture, to be partially contracted all day without fatiguing. Contraction of skeletal muscles, the organ, comes in two forms. Muscle contraction can be isotonic or it can be isometric. Let's first discuss isometric contractions. Iso means same, metric refers to length or measure. So with isometric contractions, there's no change in length. An example would be holding a weight in this position with respect to the biceps brachii, or biceps muscle, as you probably know it. So if you were to hold a weight in this position, you would feel tension in your biceps brachii, and your biceps brachii indeed would be contracting. However, the force being produced by the biceps brachii is only enough to counteract the force of gravity pulling down on the weight. So although there is contraction of the skeletal muscle fibers, and therefore the skeletal muscle as a whole, there is no change in length. This is isometric contraction. Isotonic contractions are contractions where there's no change in tension, but there is a change in muscle length. So let's go back to our isometric contraction example. So here a load is being held in a stationary position, so the load is not moving. The muscle, the biceps muscle, is producing enough force just to counteract that of gravity. Well, what if you want to start curling the load or the weight? Tension has to rise enough to start moving the load. And as the load moves, the muscle shortens. And so now we've moved from isometric contraction to isotonic contraction as the muscle shortens. Notice that as the muscle shortens, there is no change in tension being produced by that muscle. Once there was enough tension to begin to move the muscle, from that point on, there is no change in tension while the muscle is shortening. Therefore, that type of contraction is referred to as isotonic contraction. Notice that normal movements caused by the contraction of muscles includes both isometric and isotonic contractions. When you grab an object to pick it up, when you first grab it, before it moves, you'll notice tension in your muscle. That's the isometric contraction. But as soon as that object begins to move, isotonic contraction is initiated. Isotonic contraction can come in two forms. If the muscle is shortening while generating tension, then it's concentric isotonic contraction. On the other hand, if the muscle is lengthening while generating constant tension, it's eccentric isotonic contraction. At the beginning of this screencast, I mentioned that the force that a skeletal muscle, the organ, exerts depends on two things: the force produced by each contracting skeletal muscle fiber and the number of active motor units. Up to this point, we focused on the force produced by each contracting fiber. We discussed that the length of the muscle, and therefore the length of the contracting fiber and its sarcomeres, determines how much force the muscle fiber produces when it contracts. And we also examine how frequency of stimulation of a skeletal muscle fiber affects the amount of force that it exerts when it contracts. Now, let's talk specifically about the impact that the number of active motor units has on how much force a skeletal muscle, the organ, produces. Recall that a motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the skeletal muscle fibers that it stimulates. Therefore, the more motor neurons that are actively stimulating their respective skeletal muscles at any given time, the greater the force will be generated by the skeletal muscle. The effect of the number of active motor units in a skeletal muscle on the amount of tension produced by that skeletal muscle is illustrated by the following graph. Tension is shown on the y-axis, and the proportion of active motor fibers in that skeletal muscle are shown on the x-axis, increasing from left to right. At trials 1 and 2, there are no active motor fibers, therefore no tension is produced. As we move from trial 3 to trial 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, notice that there is an increase with each additional trial in the number of motor fibers that are active. So with each additional trial, we have more motor units that are active. And what we observe is a stepwise increase in the amount of tension that is produced as more and more motor fibers are active. Therefore, more and more motor units are active. This increase in tension or force produced by a skeletal muscle as a result of more and more active motor units is referred to as recruitment of motor units. Notice that at trial 7, contraction is maximal because even though more motor fibers are active at trials 8 and 9, there's no increase in tension. Let's review the objectives of the screencast. Explain the effects of muscle fiber length on the amount of tension produced by the muscle fiber. Describe a twitch, unfused tetany, and fused tetany, and describe their effects on the tension produced by a skeletal muscle fiber. Define isometric and isotonic contractions. Contrast concentric and eccentric isotonic contractions. Explain how motor units produce smooth, sustained contractions of skeletal muscles. The topic of the next screencast is providing energy for muscle contraction.